for learning analytics. And we usually do a lot of analysis. We usually do a lot of data capture. But we tend to forget that the ultimate goal is to see if we can influence or change the way the students approach learning. So our starting point for our work is, well, let's try to do that. Let's go straight for the objective. Let's see if we can go back to the students. And again, this is a very preliminary work, and our idea was to provide feedback at scale. So I have a lot of students. It's not that I can talk to each one of them. I have a very large cohort, or let's just say a large cohort. Hundreds of students. And we want to provide this feedback, and we start with the simple indicators, right? Ideally, we identify the type of feedback that is very useful, and this is based on our personal experience. The most effective feedback is when the student comes to my office, we sit at a table, and he or she tells me, these are the things that I'm struggling with, and I'm able to react and say, oh, wait a minute, you should review this, let's review that, let's clarify this concept. We're not in the position to get there one by one, but let's see how far we can go. And this is the problem we are trying to tackle here. So a few more words about feedback, and this is why this presentation will appear very good, because I'm using exactly the same citation that Paul Kirchner did. So brownie points for me, and I didn't change this slide during the keynote, okay, I promise. Just to make sure we are in the same page here, and also to trying to push a bit more this message that focusing on feedback is a good thing to drive the effectiveness of learning analytics. And feedback is this mechanism by which we try to influence, we try to go back to the student or the learning scenario and try to provide them with information that will affect performance and understanding. I've read a few papers that try to define feedback as a text or feedback as a message. I am leaning more towards feedback as a process. It has to be a process. Not until you achieve certain change on the student or change on their beliefs or their knowledge it is actually effective. So we need to focus a bit more on this end point and see if we can drive the use of learning analytics towards that objective. Just to make sure we're on the right track here, and this is something that is a bit redundant, but I think it's worth reflecting for a little bit. The frequency of feedback is actually something good. Or it's actually, let me put it a little bit more mild, it's something that is worth looking into. So it's not enough, and this is stating the obvious, right? If I tell my students, oh, go, we're gonna go for a course, it's gonna be great. I'm not gonna talk to you for the next 13 weeks, and then I'll meet you in the exam. This is not gonna work. We have to actually go the other way around. And more often, what we are doing here is walking into situations in which we want to take care of how you self-regulate. So we would like to give you perhaps some food for thought, something that makes you think about, are you approaching the material, the course in the right strategy today? And maybe you can change something for tomorrow or maybe for the next week. So this is a type of context that I think learning analytics is very well positioned to try to address, although we are not quite addressing it properly. I like this publication very much by the colleagues from Michigan because they identify two types of feedback that we should be very aware of. Sometimes for us, feedback, for us as in the learning analytics community is we provide very valuable information to the instructor. That's it. Well, not quite. The instructor then has to fill the gap and say, what do I do with that information? And that's another area that we need to explore a little bit farther. On the other side of the spectrum is, why not providing the information directly to the students? And this is a little bit controversial because some instructor might say, wait a minute, you're talking to my students, I should know about it. What kind of feedback are you feeding there? And the way we address this is by using just basic feedback. And I'll tell you a little bit more details about the type of things we're doing. The other thing that worries me a little bit is that, and there is literature sustaining this, at least in higher education, we are finally and slowly gravitating towards active learning. Now, imagine you're a student, and I tell you that, yeah, the course is going to be great. I'm going to be asking you to be totally engaged. Every week we're going to do a lot of things, but I'm not going to talk back to you. That's not fair. If we are asking our students to be engaged, because engagement is probably a good idea to achieve their educational objectives, then we have to do our part and keep going back to them and sustain this conversation, this dialogue. Again, if you have a lot of students, you already see the problem, but at least it's a good objective to have in mind. So in some situations, what happens if we are very ambitious to keep our students in the loop and use a lot of data to see if we can provide them feedback, this may not be a scale if this feedback has to go through the instructor. Now again, before you start disagreeing with me in Twitter, I'm not saying we have to remove the instructor. Actually, far from reality. I'm a very strong believer on hybrid system in which the instructor is the expert, and there is a lot of knowledge and intuition there. What we are exploring here is a little bit of an angle that say, okay, if my students, for example, keep asking me, how am I doing in the course? How am I doing in the course? That's probably a certain amount of feedback that would be feasible for a tutor to say, oh yeah, let's provide that to the students automatically. And this is a little tiny area that we explore in this study. There has been some very interesting previous studies, which I think are pointing in the right direction. And if you look back on the literature in learning analytics, you see that there are a lot of visualizations and a lot of dashboards in there. We have to probably push it a bit more and say, okay, dashboards ultimately is the information we put in front of the students, but again, we're looking for feedback. We're looking for a change, for an effect. So maybe it's for us time to start thinking, what is the effect of that dashboard? How do they react? Do they like it or not? Is it useful or not? Because otherwise, we have the risk of just sitting ourselves and look at those histograms. They are great. Well, maybe not. You have to talk to your students. So this is a very interesting study by colleagues in Melbourne that they did about the reaction. And we are exploring a little bit exactly that type of reaction. So the objective here is to give you an idea of the scenario we're tackling. Let's focus on feedback. We find it very useful to drive us, very useful to restrict the type of things we're trying to do. Let's see if we tackle active learning scenarios, which makes sense to go back to them frequently. Let's try to see what happens if we try to do this automatically. In real time, and this is something that as soon as you go to blended learning, they are working on a Saturday at 3 in the morning. And they want feedback. And I'm not going to be up at 3 in the morning answering questions, but we do something. Even if it is something simple. And then the other angle that we wanted to explore is, let's provide feedback that is some sort of meaningful indicator. Again, the number of times you clicked on something might not be that useful for a student. They want to know something a bit more precise, and this is what we're trying to explore here. And then we'll see how do students use dashboards. Now, in this study, we didn't ask them. There is no self-reported information, which is good because Paul Kirchner just said it doesn't work, right? This is just looking about what happens if we float a dashboard out there and just look at their interaction. Context, first year engineering course, around 400 students, 300, 400. It's based on flipped learning, which means you ask them to do a lot of things. And we are going to focus on the preparation activity. So that's the activity you say, please do this before you come face to face. And they usually need feedback about that. So this is another way of representing it. During the week, and this is a pattern that repeats every week, we will ask them first to prepare some initial activities, then we'll meet face-to-face in a class, and then some other things happen. This study focuses on providing them real-time automatic feedback, basic feedback about meaningful indicators on that stage. Why? Because we found this is one stage that they're worried about, this first contact with the material. So they keep talking to you like, am I doing okay? Is this the right thing to do? Is this what you were expecting? So what do we do? Well, first we provide a few active resources, all in electronic format in a blended learning site. And then, of course, as you can imagine, we track everything. So step number 1, we collect. Step number 2, we analyze. And then we produce this dashboard. Now, the paper doesn't quite go into details on how we came to this dashboard, but the quick summary behind this is that forget about sophisticated measure. Forget about the kind of thing that makes us engineers or data scientists excited. Think as a student. And what they keep asking is, how am I doing with respect to the cohort? Well, that's what we'll give you. So you're supposed to watch videos. We'll give you an indicator of your video engagement. Now, look at this needle. It goes from 0 to 100. It is not the number of clicks in the video. It is not the number of plays. We actually made an indicator that summarizes that and kind of conveys the bottom line to the student, which is, yeah, you check 3 of the 4 videos, therefore it's 75%. What do you mean by check? Well, check. Behind that, there is a formula that says if you watch the video for more than 75% of its duration, we'll take it as you watched it. But they're not interested in those details. They just want to know, how am I doing? Am I doing the right thing with the videos? This is what we are conveying. And then we also chose to show the class average. And the class average is a little bit of a trick behind that. You don't show the class average. You show the average of those that engage with the video. So the person that didn't engage with the video looks at the dashboard and, oh my God, everybody's working with the videos. Marketing, it's a marketing technique. As long as it is legal, I'm okay for that. So this is the information we are conveying to them. And the other trick is that we update this in real time. So every 15 minutes, we collect this information. There is a little bit of a detail that, again, is not in the paper, which is the architecture that goes behind, which has a little bit of a sense-making step from basic data to these indicators. And the other thing that is very important in this dashboard, these indicators connect directly with the specific points in the course material. So again, you try to fill that gap for the students. They are not supposed to be interpreting stuff. You are supposed to do that for them and offer them something that makes immediate sense. So if the student comes here and says, oh, how's the week looking? And no video activity, nothing with the questions next to the video, well, you know where to go. You go to week 4 and it says videos. Okay, you go there, work on the videos. And 15 minutes later, you see that needle goes whoop, a little bit up. So we are conveying to you is like, all right, yeah, this is supposed to be going along those lines. Again, it's basic indication. We are not telling them you're going to succeed. We're just saying, if you're worried about what you should be doing, this is, for us, our way to tell you very quickly at 3 in the morning on a Saturday that things are supposed to be going more or less around what we expected. And then the other thing we do is every week we reset all these things because we want them every week to be engaged. So what happened this week is okay, next week back to 0. And we kind of convey to them that we are behind you trying to give you this basic information. All right, so we push the button, we let this thing run for a year. What kind of results did we obtain from this? And again, this is a bit of a preliminary study, and we look at 3 or 4 things very, very basic. So first thing we did, we tried to see if there was any clustering, and the type of clustering they emerge when we count the number of times they go and visualize the dashboard. I forgot to say one important thing. The link to access the dashboard was there in the front page of all the documents in the course. So you use a web template, and you put on the left the links to access the discussion board because it's very important, the material, and something that said engagement, I don't know what the word, or progression or something. So if you click in there, you go to this dashboard I'll show you. So it was very easy to get to that dashboard. How often did they enter? Well, we have 64% of them, they enter not very frequently. So this was already one way for us to understand what kind of population do we have, what kind of reactions are we seeing. So some of them, the 2/3 of them, they don't access very frequently. Another cluster, which we call the medium, E stands for, I forgot, my master student told me that medium frequency or medium, they go a little bit more frequently to check the dashboard. And again, these are figures per session. So they might be working with 3 or 4 sessions and then they check only once or twice. The third one is the high access, fairly frequently. And then we identify a few students that are continuously accessing the dashboard. So this was our first peek outside of the box and say, oh, look, this is what is happening. And again, we didn't make it as far as why is this person checking the dashboard so often? And maybe this is the first data to say, okay, we need to unpack that a little bit. But at least we do have solid evidence that there are different populations handling this tool. The second result we did is we counted the events that occur before they reach the dashboard and after they reach the dashboard. And basically what we did is if you connect to the course at 3 in the morning on a Saturday, how long does it take to check the dashboard? Do you wait until the end, the middle, the beginning? And what we are seeing here is that if they check this in the middle, we have 1/3 of the population roughly that they do 12 things before they check the dashboard and another 10 afterwards. So these are a type of behavior that seems to point that they get going a little bit and then they go back and see how's it going, and then they come back and keep working, which is interesting. Some of them, they usually click more towards the end. Look, 44 events. So they actually get going quite a lot. And then at the end, they say, okay, let me check what happens. Oh, wrap it up. Perhaps make some adjustments here. The ones at the beginning, these are also very interesting. You see, we have the population distributed almost in 4 equal-sized clusters. This is a little bit small. This one, what it says is right at the beginning. So not, sorry, at the beginning. This is more towards the middle of the session. Yeah, towards the middle of the session, but it's different from this one because it's more middle of the session, but we have 20 events. So there is a little bit more and a very long tail here, a much larger tail. And then we have this one, which is checking in the middle of the session, but this is a much larger session. So what we have here are students that have a very long engagement with the material, and they check the dashboard in the middle. So again, we have 4 different populations that we are identifying. And again, some of these results, as I said, are a little bit preliminary, point to a lot of interesting avenues to explore. And finally, what we did is a little bit of a study saying, okay, if we classify the students with these labels here, and this cluster seems to be fairly reliable, what happens over time? And this was something that it was in the back of our mind. And this is something, again, that learning analytics is moving towards that space. And I think we need a little bit more effort in there. It's like, yeah, students are grouping clusters. Yeah, that's today, but next week there'll be different clusters, and students keep moving up and down because, you know, we all do lots of things and we chase from week to week. So we wanted to see what was the use of the dashboard from week 1 to week 13 in the semester. So lots of interesting things here happen. Initially, immediately you see that this dashboard is very popular, and then this thing kind of like goes away. A possible interpretation is that, well, they have to get a hold of this routine. At the beginning, they probably need to check back, and then as the semester goes, yeah, they got a hold of this, and it's probably not that necessary for me to keep checking. The other thing is the difference between the colors. This is at the beginning of the session, so we have a peak. So checking the dashboard at the beginning of the session seems to be very popular. As the semester goes by, this difference is not so big. Here we have not such an important difference. The yellow one is checking the dashboard at the end, and you can see that the yellow one, it's kind of like gaining ground. So there seems to be also a change in behavior. Students maybe initially check the dashboard very quickly at the beginning, then they know what it is for, and towards the end, they try to check it more like, yeah, I do a few things, and then check, make sure that I'm going on the right track. So again, like I said, these are interesting initial results. The other interesting result, and this perhaps could have been included in the fail-a-thon the other day, right, is that we got excited and said, oh, we have a population that handles this dashboard differently. We also detected that the behavior changes over time. I'm sure there is a correlation with academic performance, and there's not. There's nothing. But again, like any other scientist, we go from failure to failure with undiminished excitement. We thought, what we have here is pointing us to the fact that we have a very varied population. We just probably didn't unpack it enough to know exactly what is the effect on this. And if we go back to this cluster here, I can imagine people in this mid-long cluster that says they access the dashboard in a very long session. That very long session could be a very thorough student in all the material, making sure everything is okay, or a very confused student that is going back and forth and is not exactly figuring out. So in a sense, it makes a little bit of sense that we don't have that correlation, but it's pointing us to avenues to explore farther. So in conclusion, with this little example, what we're trying to push here is, let's give the students quick feedback. Basic things. Again, I'm not saying or advocating that we remove the tutor out of the equation, quite the opposite. Most of the reactions to this dashboard may require then a touching base with your expert and say, what is it happening that I'm engaging with all these resources and yet I'm not getting it? All right, that's when the expert comes in. But at least we covered a little bit of a space, which is being in touch with them, and they seem to be using that resource. It is valuable to them because they go and visit it fairly frequently. We believe that this is suitable for active learning scenarios. If we're asking them to keep engaged and they have to keep working on that, well, there should be something in there telling them what is happening. And of course, we need to combine it with a little bit of a qualitative analysis and unpack what are the reactions. And this is something that we probably look into the future. And the other thing that we didn't look at, and definitely, is dashboard variation. We decided to give everybody the same dashboard. Things like, for example, turning off the comparison with the rest of the class. If you are overperforming, that's basic marketing principle. If you are over the average, we don't tell you. We just want you to be there, right? Otherwise, you have the opposite effect. Oh, I'm doing much better than the rest. So let's stop working with the videos. Those are the kind of things we need to explore further. That's it. Okay.
Questions? Hi, I really like your talk. This is Mei Feng from SRI. I have two questions that are kind of relevant to each other. They're both about student behaviors. Like in your table 3, you showed 4 clusters, right? 4 groups of students, and the number of events before and after dashboard varies so much. Like if you add them together, right? The top group is like total of 30 maybe, or around 40, and the last group are like around 100, right? So. I'm just wondering, like, what are the events they're doing? Like, have you looked at, like, what's the behaviors that they're, doing before, and especially like after they review the dashboard, what are they doing, right? Is to dive deeper into, like, are they doing anything in corresponding to what they are seeing in the dashboard to change their behavior or just keep doing what they're doing and try to get some sense of like what's the explanation why this viewing doesn't correlate with their performance?
Yep, that's an excellent question, and we do have the material to do that study because the type of events that we are considering here are fairly, I wouldn't say limited, but we have a limited number of categories of events, and that's something that we were about to do, but we didn't get time, but we know how to do, which is after you check the dashboard. The other thing we are recording, I didn't mention, another event we are recording is when you check the dashboard and the magnitudes that are shown in the dashboard. So we can perform an additional study, which is after you look at the dashboard and your video engagement says 0, you go back and check the videos. And this is something that we haven't done, but the data is there, and this is something, that we'll include definitely. And will tell us if the dashboard is prompting a reaction or not, much more compelling. Yeah, excellent.
Hi, I'm very by the casual attitude that you use about misleading your students. And let me explain why. There is an ethical argument to be made. I'm not going to go there. I'm going to talk about practical things.
Yep.
Students are going to get very sophisticated about understanding the general class of things, especially in new generations that are done in these algorithms.
Yes.
You just said on a talk on the web that you're lying to your students.
No.
And if you're not, listen a second.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's fine if you do. At least you are misleading them and you thought it was a good idea. That's fine, that's your choice. But that means that is going to affect my students, because then my students are going to start wondering whether I'm lying to them. So the field as a whole needs to be very careful about this. Otherwise, the students are going to start wondering what we're doing, and the interventions are going to be less effective. I think we have to be careful about this.
Okay, let me explain a little bit more what I'm doing here, because it was not properly conveyed to you. So I show this dashboard to my students. And my students ask me, why is my needle down there? And I totally agree with you. I am totally transparent about that. And I said, look, this needle will go up if you watch the video more than 75%. Totally transparent. And I totally agree with you that I make an effort to give my students as much information as they need about this for two reasons. First, because it's a tool that they have to use. Second, because it's their data that I'm using. The middle ground that I'm trying to walk here is I need to make a choice about what is the first information I put in front of them. That first information I get to choose. I have the freedom to say, should I just give you a needle that says this or that? I need to put a needle out there with a value. I get to choose. Now, what I'm trying to convey to you is that I make that choice with a specific intention, and I back that choice with total transparency. Thanks.
Thanks, Abelardo. Can you go back to the actual dashboard slide? Yeah. So I wanted to follow up on the first question a little bit, and I think it's really great that you're talking about the fact that this is not replacing the teacher. It could be a starting point for dialogue and all of that. And so my questions revolve a little bit around the student perspective in how do they make sense of and act on this information. And so I think there's two aspects of that I wanted to ask about. And the first is the notion of the reference point, right? So you can get your data and you can see that you're at 60% or 80%, and the question is how to make sense of that. And you've got the color coding so they can sort of see good or bad, and then you've also got the class. And you mentioned that if they saw they're above everybody, they might be incented to do less. There's also problems of always being below the average. And we've seen in studies that students can have an emotional reaction. This isn't just cognitive saying, oh, I'm doing less well than everybody else, I should do better. They can feel pretty hopeless sometimes, and especially if the average keeps going up. And so I'm wondering if you've thought about alternative reference points that aren't just, here's the, everybody can't be above average, here's a single point, but showing a spread or something like that. So that's part one. And part two is about taking action, because if it's sort of saying, watching 75%, as a student, okay, I'm not doing so well, how do I change what I'm doing? And I feel like going to watch 76% of every video isn't what you're aiming for.
Yeah, fantastic question. I'm really glad you asked that question. So the two answers I have for that is the spirit behind the study was, this is very complex. It's plagued by issues and decisions and everything. Let's first get some initial version in there and see how it goes, and then let's think about variations. So one of the variations that we already have in mind is letting a student choose what do they want to see. They might want to see some of these, they might not want to see the class, and pushing the choice back to the students to say you have the choice to see that information. That is improvement number one. And number two, we also identified that it's a bit rough to just a needle, right, with a value. What we're exploring, we have some preliminary data, but not yet ready for prime time, is getting back to them with a text that says, we detect that, not in this term, right? You have to be very careful how you articulate your feedback, but it would be along the lines of, you probably need to review these activities with this type of questions because they are very important, and focus in this topic. And that other topic would be an interpretation of the needle in a much more sensitive way in that context. But for that, what we are exploring is bringing the expert in. So not a message that goes randomly, but an expert that sits down and says, okay, this is what I would tell my students if they didn't engage with this resource. And then we collate these type of messages and we send them every week. So that's the route we're following. But I agree, this was a very quick and fast way of see if that was possible, the issues we encounter along the way, all these choices that we weren't aware of, and all of a sudden we are faced like, oh my God, we need to decide what kind of dashboard do we put out there and see how it goes. Yeah, thanks.